Picture a medieval peasant. Go on, close your eyes. He's covered in mud, right? Probably eating a raw turnip and smelling like a wet dog that rolled in compost. Thanks to movies, we think the Middle Ages was just a 1,000-year mud wrestling tournament, where taking a bath was considered a crime against nature. But what if I told you that medieval people actually loved being clean? Yes, the Dark Ages had soap, and hot water, and strict rules about smelling good. You see, our modern obsession with the filthy peasant is completely fake. In reality, you wouldn't survive a single medieval dinner party if your hands were dirty. They would literally kick you out for bad hygiene. How do we know this? Because medieval cities were packed with public bathhouses. They weren't hiding from water, they were paying good coin to soak in it. Think of it as the medieval version of going to a local day spa. Minus the smooth jazz and cucumber water, of course. So where did this dirty myth come from? Who framed the Middle Ages? Spoiler alert, it was the guys who came after them, the enlightened ones. But we'll get to those powdered hypocrites later. Right now, grab your towel and your copper coins. We're going inside to see how a real medieval person got clean. Welcome to the Stews, the bustling medieval public bathhouse. And no, despite the name, they weren't cooking people in giant pots. This was the ultimate medieval hangout spot, a place to get clean and gossip. You walk in, hand your hard-earned copper to the attendant, and strip down. Inside, you'd find massive wooden tubs lined with soft linen sheets. The water was kept perfectly warm by huge roaring fires in the back room. You didn't bathe alone. You hopped in with your neighbors, the local baker, and maybe a merchant or two. It was basically a medieval Zoom meeting, but entirely naked. They actually served food and wine right across wooden boards placed over the tubs. Just how common were these watery wonderlands? By the 13th century, Paris had over 30 public bathhouses operating daily. Vienna boasted 29. Even small towns made sure they had at least one local bath. Bath attendants were so organized, they even had their own official guild. They regulated everything, ensuring the water was clean and the temperature was just right. Sounds like a terrible, dirty time, doesn't it? So much mud everywhere. Attendants would even scrub your back with natural sponges and bundle of twigs. Many places had steam rooms, operating exactly like a medieval sauna. The word stews comes from the large stoves used to heat the rooms. Sure, later on, some of these bathhouses developed alternative reputations. Hence the modern confusion about what exactly they were stewing in there. But for the average baker or blacksmith, it was strictly a place to wash off the soot and sweat of the day. Historical records suggest city folks visited at least once a week. Goodbye, Hollywood mud monster. Hello, squeaky clean medieval citizen. But water alone isn't enough. It was time for the secret medieval weapon, soap. Now, medieval soap wasn't exactly invented in a sterile, modern laboratory. People usually made their own, using a very glamorous mixture of animal fat and wood ash. Yes, you cleaned yourself with the leftover grease from last night's mutton roast. But it absolutely worked! By the 13th century, there were entire professional soap-making guilds. Cities like Bristol and Naples were actually famous across Europe for mass-producing high-quality, hard soaps. It might not have smelled like a lavender ocean breeze, but it stripped the dirt right off. But what if you were too poor to afford a hot bath or fancy fat soap every single day? Enter the absolute superpower of medieval hygiene, linen undergarments. Everyone wore a linen layer, called a shift or smock, directly against their skin. Linen is highly absorbent. It acted like a wearable sponge, soaking up all the sweat and body oils. You see, washing heavy woolen outer clothes would ruin them and wash out the expensive dye. So instead, they simply washed the linen underlayer constantly. Changing your linen was basically the medieval equivalent of taking a shower. A crisp white linen collar peeking out of your neckline was the ultimate status symbol. It loudly announced to the world, "Look at me, I'm rich enough to hire a washerwoman." They rubbed the linen with ashlie, pounded it, and laid it out in the sun to bleach it bright white. So even a peasant sweating in a field stayed relatively fresh thanks to their magical linen trap. Which is much more than we can say for the people living a few centuries later. It wasn't just about smelling good, though. Staying clean was a matter of basic medieval morality. The Middle Ages produced dozens of etiquette manuals, and rule number 1 was always the same. Wash your hands and face when you wake up, and wash them before every single meal. Since forks weren't really a thing yet, you ate your roasted meat entirely with your fingers. So hosts actually paraded water basins and towels around the dining hall before anyone touched the bread. And the church was completely on board with this clean agenda. Monasteries were essentially the medieval world's plumbing experts. They built elaborate washrooms called lavatoriums, where monks were required to scrub down before prayers. To the medieval mind, physical dirt was literally linked to spiritual sin. A dirty body meant a dirty soul. Then you had the medieval doctors, who were completely obsessed with keeping your pores open. They believed health was governed by the 4 humors, and washing helped balance them out by sweating off the bad stuff. Famous medical treatises from the 14th century heavily prescribed warm baths to cure almost anything. Feeling melancholic? Take a bath. Digestion issues? Take a warm bath. Though to be fair, a hot bath won't save you from eating a week-old medieval meat pie. They even had specific rules for washing hair, involving herbal rinses with rosemary and chamomile. Medieval beauty standards demanded clear skin and shiny hair, not a crust of mud. So, society, religion, and medicine all agreed. Water is your absolute best friend. Until suddenly, medical science completely flipped the script. So, if medieval people were essentially water-loving spa enthusiasts, what went wrong? Enter the late 15th century, the Renaissance, and a brand new, terrifying guest. Specifically, a terrible outbreak of syphilis that swept through Europe in the 1490s. Since bathhouses were communal, and sometimes very friendly, they became absolute hotspots for the disease. Suddenly, hanging out naked with 30 strangers didn't seem like such a healthy weekend plan. But it wasn't just the disease itself. It was how Renaissance doctors completely misunderstood it. Medical science experienced a brilliant, spectacular regression. The new, enlightened medical theory claimed that warm water was actually a death trap. Why? Because hot water and steam supposedly opened your pores. And to the 16th century mind, an open pore was just an open door for disease to march right in. They believed disease was carried in miasmas, or invisible foul smells in the air. So obviously, the logical solution was to seal your body shut entirely. How do you seal your pores? By never, ever washing off the dirt and sweat. Dirt became your literal armor against the plague, a protective crust of absolute grime. Royal physicians officially advised kings to avoid hot baths at all costs, lest they invite the sickness inside. Washing your face was considered extremely dangerous. Washing your feet was practically suicide. Thus, the golden age of medieval public baths came to a crashing, filthy halt. Across Europe, city councils ordered the magnificent bathhouses to be permanently closed and dismantled. The very places that kept peasants and lords clean for centuries were left to rot. And so began the celebrated era of the Renaissance. A time of brilliant art, poetry, and staggering body odor. While Da Vinci was painting masterpieces, his wealthy patrons were terrified of a simple bucket of warm water. The irony is unbearable. The so-called Enlightenment literally plunged Europe into a dark age of hygiene. They traded the hot medieval spas for dry towels and absurd amounts of heavy perfumes to mask the stench. But here's the best part. These unwashed nobles needed a scapegoat for their own filthy habits. So, if the Renaissance elite were terrified of water, how did the Middle Ages get the dirty reputation? Well, when you write the history books, you get to make the rules. The thinkers of the Enlightenment wanted to look vastly superior to the past they had just replaced. To do that, they branded the entire medieval period as the Dark Ages, a time of savage ignorance and filth. It was a brilliant 500-year-long smear campaign, literally smearing them with imaginary mud. With the invention of the printing press, this anti-medieval propaganda spread like wildfire. Soon, everyone believed that medieval knights were just rusty, smelly tin cans, and that peasants practically lived in piles of manure because they didn't know any better. Fast forward to the Victorian era, and things got even worse for the medieval reputation. Victorian writers loved romanticizing the past with Gothic novels full of dramatic, grim, and dirty settings. They decided that history wasn't interesting enough without a thick layer of authentic peasant grime. And of course, modern Hollywood took these dramatic 19th century novels as absolute historical fact. That's exactly why every movie peasant you see today looks like a walking mudslide. It is the ultimate historical irony. The people who actually smelled like walking trash bins successfully convinced us that the society with public spas and hand-washing rules were the dirty ones. Talk about some top-tier elite projection. For example, the famous French King Louis XIV reportedly bathed only 3 times in his entire life. 3 times. Over a span of 72 years. Let that soak in. He relied entirely on changing his dry linen shirts and dousing himself in heavy perfumes to mask the royal stench. If he had walked into a 13th century tavern, the medieval peasants would have kicked him out for smelling so bad. So yes, history is truly written by the victors. Or in this specific case, by the people who own the most toxic white face powder and heavily scented handkerchiefs. But now that we've washed away the mud of centuries, it's time for the final verdict. So, the final verdict? The filthy medieval peasant is a complete and utter scam. They had hot public baths, mandatory hand washing, and fresh linen undergarments. It was the enlightened guys in wigs who decided that hot water was practically an assassin. Because nothing screams advanced civilization like sealing your pores with the crust of your own sweat. The next time you watch a historical movie, remember the truth. That mud-covered extra in the background should probably be complaining about the lack of rosemary soap. The Middle Ages wasn't perfect. They still thought bloodletting was a solid medical strategy, but they definitely knew how to draw a nice, hot communal bath and keep their linen clean. Which brings us to another massive, towering myth about the medieval mind. We all know they thought the earth was completely flat, right? That Christopher Columbus had to bravely prove to a bunch of ignorant peasants that it was a globe? Well, prepare to have your historical illusions shattered all over again, because the medieval educated class actually knew the exact shape of the planet. Tomorrow, did people really believe the earth was flat in the Middle Ages? We're going to debunk the biggest geographic lie ever told and find out who really started it. Who invented the flat earth myth? And why do so many people still believe it today? Subscribe to uncover the next historical myth. Stay clean out there, and don't let the Renaissance tell you how to live.